Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Mysterious Galaxy virtual event. I'm Nick, the Director of Events and Digital Marketer for the bookstore. Today, we have a wonderful event. We have Maxim Jakubowski, Peter Lovesey, and Elsie Tyler. Unfortunately, author Stella Duffy couldn't make it today. She was feeling under the weather, but we send her our love and hope she gets feeling better soon. We are discussing today the first CW Daggers Award retrospective, Daggers Drawn. I really love that cover. So, as I said, we have Maxim, Peter, and Elsie here to discuss the book and their various works. If you have any questions, please go ahead and submit them down below. There'll be a link that says Ask a Question. We'll be pulling that later on in the event. If you haven't already, you can buy the book, Daggers Drawn. Below, there'll be a link that says Buy Daggers Drawn, and I'll take you to our website. All right, without further ado, I'm going to disappear, and I'll see you all at the end. Take it away, gentlemen.
I was going to say good evening, as we are all in the UK, and it's 8 o'clock at night here, but I gather, of course, out there, Mysterious Galaxy are in California, so are 8 hours ahead of us, and of course anybody else in America will be in a different time zone. But all I can say is that anybody watching from the USA, you're in the fortunate position of being younger than us. I'm Maxine Jakubowski. I'm the editor of the Daggers Drawn volume, and also coincidentally the current chair of the British Crime Writers Association. And by happy coincidence, both my interlocutors here, Peter Lovesey and Len, who's quite happy to be called Len rather than LC, Len Tyler, are both also previous chairs. In the life of British crime writers, sometimes becoming chair of the CWA almost becomes inevitable, or in some cases because there's a lack of volunteers. I mean, it's a wonderful organization, and we are currently in the very happy situation that we have reached a record number of members, and we're now up to 850 members. And my personal ambition, as I will be in the chair for another 16 months, is that we might actually reach 1,000 members by the end of my chairmanship. Now, the CWA has been going for many years, many decades. I should have done my research and checked before coming here to remind myself of the actual year, but we are talking, I think, 50 or 60 years. Apart from supporting and promoting crime and thriller fiction, one of the CWA's other more visible activities is the award of the Daggers, which are the equivalent to the Mystery Writers of America Edgars. And of course, we have Peter here, who has won countless Edgars and is also obviously a Mystery Writers of America Grandmaster. And the Daggers basically have been going for many, many years. There are many categories like the Edgars, although we do have some different categories. We have a category for crime fiction and translation, which we don't have. We don't have crime or TV awards. But what we're talking about today is the short story dagger. Now, the short story dagger began nearly 40 years ago. It was added to the Daggers and to reward basically the best short story of the year. Now, technically speaking, and if you get hold of the book, which I hope you will, and we entice you to do so with our witty talk over the next 45 minutes or so. Basically, in my introduction, I did a bit of research in the archives of the CWA and ascertained that actually for the first 3 or 4 years, the award was not actually called a dagger. It was a competition which was organized by the CWA with a major British newspaper and a major champagne manufacturer. And the winner was given like the competitors were given 3 words and asked to write a new short story using those 3 words. And the winner won, I think, 12 bottles of 12 bottles of the most expensive champagne. And one of the first winners was the writer Peter O'Donnell, who then wrote, of course, as Madeline Brent, which was the name he used for his Gothic sort of romances, as opposed to the Modesty Blairs, which novels which he wrote as under his own name. Over the years, the short story dagger has been given to some of the greatest names in the field, not just British. I mean, many American writers have won it. And in the volume, we have stories by Jeffrey Deaver, by Larry Beinhart, Richard Langer, in fact, who's been away from the writing scene for a few years now, but I've just read an advance copy of a new novel, his first novel in 10 years, which Mulholland Books are publishing in America in June, and it's a wonderful book, and which I certainly recommend it. Of course, a number of British writers have won it over the years: Ian Rankin, John Connolly, Denise Miner, John Harvey, and of course, my 2 interlocutors here, Peter Lovesey and Len Tyler. And in fact, Peter has actually won it twice. Now, I'm known for editing a lot of anthologies, and it sort of struck me, it was one of those ideas where you think, why has nobody done it before? And I thought, 40 years or so of short story dagger winners, nobody's collected them before. It was one of those such an obvious idea. So basically, that's what Daggers Drawn is. I got in touch with some of my favorite authors who had all won the dagger. Many of them had won it twice, like Peter. Ian Rankin had won it twice. Reginald Hill, the late Reginald Hill, had won it twice. And I asked, obviously, whether we could reprint their stories. And in the case of people who had won the award twice, they actually decided which story they preferred. My only disappointment is that we were unable to reissue the winning dagger short story winners by both Reginald Hill and Robert Barnard, both sadly no longer with us because of the arrangements the various states had made with publishers or copyright problems with the stories. But nonetheless, I think we have a really prestigious volume. Basically, that's what the book is. The book came out in September of last year, and the publishers are so happy with the book. It's come out in hardcover in both the UK and the USA, and the paperback will be coming out in another 6 months. But the publishers are so happy that I'm now working on a follow-up volume, which will be basically short stories which have been shortlisted for the Dagger. Obviously, that's the natural follow-up. So we've had winners in this volume, and next year we'll have stories shortlisted, and I've already had agreements from Michael Connolly, Max Allen Collins, and obviously the estate of the late Mickey Spillane, so we'll have even more American writers in there. Anyway, enough of me. I write crime, but obviously I've never won the short story Dagger, quite deservedly so, because I haven't done that many short stories. I'm more of a novelist. So I'd like basically to go to Peter. See, you've won it twice, Peter, and you've won it for 2 stories, but the one you agreed for us to reprint, i.e. which you prefer out of those particular 2 winners, was a story called Needle Match. Can you tell us about a bit about the story and how the inspiration came for that particular story?
Yes,
even though I know it goes back many years now.
Yes, it's very difficult to talk about a short story without giving the whole thing away. It basically it's set around the game of tennis, which I'm not all that excited about, but my wife is. She'll watch it constantly if it's as long as it's on TV, and she watches the tournaments that go on all the year round. So I've got to learn a certain amount about tennis simply by seeing her watching TV avidly. I thought about the ball boys in particular. They interested me more perhaps than the main players, and the way that they're trained evidently. And I did a little bit of research to find out about ball boys. They're very, very carefully trained to carry out the functions that they do, and the idea is that they really have to be invisible. They should not be sort of intrude on the play in any way at all. They as soon as they've collected the ball, they go back and stand stiffly at the side, and the match goes on. And only when a ball has to be retrieved to the ball boys do you see the ball boys. So I have the idea of a military figure who trains the ball boys. He's called the Brigadier, and it's rather told from the point of view of two of the ball boys who were picked, and really the sort of the background to that, and they see something very fishy going on the court in a big match, and I'm not going to say very much more because it'll give away too much of the story. You were kind enough at the beginning, Maxim, to say that I'd won numerous Edgars. In fact, I've never won an Edgar.
Oh, I was confusing you with your Grandmaster Award.
Oh, I see. Yes. Well, that I do have a nice figure of Edgar Allan Poe for that, which is lovely. I've been nominated a few times over there, but it's writing short stories is for me a relaxation really after writing a novel. I can't do them while I'm at work on a novel. I sometimes I'm asked, well, you asked me before now, I think, Maxim, whether I'd write a short story for one of your anthologies. And I've had to say, well, no, I've only just started a novel. It'll be some time before I get round to writing short stories again. So it's something, I need full concentration. And I do for a novel and I do for a short story. And a short story will take me perhaps 2 or 3 weeks to write. And I enjoy it enormously because you can try out different things that you wouldn't normally do in a novel. You can take risks. So you might tell the story, like you couldn't, that ball boy idea I was talking about just now, you could hardly sustain that through an entire novel. But it's ideal for a short story. Mm-hmm. And now I think it's time that we've moved over to Len.
I was going to ask you before we move on to Len. We'll give.
All right. There's something else.
I mean, you mentioned obviously. I'm picking up on something you said. You mentioned that obviously you were not highly knowledgeable about tennis, but of course some of you are very knowledgeable about sport in general. Obviously, some of your early novels are heavily reliant on your knowledge of sport, and you've actually worked obviously in that area.
The history of sport, really. Yes. That is a very strong interest of mine. And the very first book I ever wrote was a history of long distance running, which is very difficult to find now.
Collector's item, as we say.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. And Len, now your story, which was a more recent winner, is The Trials of Margaret. What was the genesis of that particular story?
Well, I was very impressed that Peter could actually remember exactly how he did get to his story. With mine, like most of mine, I've no idea where the ideas came from. Absolutely none. Martin Edwards asked me to write a short story for a book called Motives for Murder, which was written in Peter's honour for a significant birthday, Peter. And I just had to come up with a story. Now, I have served on juries, so there may have been a little bit of that, but certainly in the days when it wouldn't have been possible to send texts backwards and forwards between the defendant and the jury members, because my story concerns somebody who has a lady who has murdered her husband, and you learn that right at the very beginning. And the question is whether she's going to get away with it. And she discovers that she is able to send texts to one of the members of the jury, and receives a number of texts from them, which seem to be quite sympathetic. And the question is whether she's actually going to get away with it or not. And I think I'd better not say whether she does get away with it, but there is a twist. There is a twist at the end.
Mm-hmm. Now, Peter mentioned that, of course, he's incapable of writing a short story if he's working on a novel. How do you fit short stories in between your novels? Because you are still writing, obviously. You have two very distinct
two series, yeah.
novel series. Could you tell us about those two series of novels?
Yeah, one is a contemporary humorous crime series, and while we're boasting about our awards, I should say that I've won the Last Laugh Award twice for that particular series. And it features a crime writer who solved crimes. That's probably a bit of a cliche, together with his agent, and they're named Ethelred and Elsie. And that book now runs to that series now runs to 9 books. And I write a series set in the 17th century, a historical crime series featuring a lawyer and spy named John Gray. And they're both published in the UK and in the States, though the publication in the States is sort of 4 or 5 books behind those in the UK in both cases.
Mm-hmm. And how do you find, basically, what is the difference? Is it a question of mentality, of workmanship? What is the difference for you between writing a novel and writing a short story? How do you approach them differently?
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about a short story is that usually when you start it, you can see the whole thing, the beginning, the middle, and the end, as a fairly manageable entity. Whereas when I'm writing a book, I will have pages and pages of notes beside me in 4 or 5 different colors, all mapping the various threads through the story. And it's sometimes quite difficult to grasp the whole thing, whereas a short story is just nice and manageable. And as Peter implied, I mean, it's quite a nice thing to do between novels. Peter, I'm really impressed that you can spend 2 to 3 weeks, did you say, on each short story? I mean, I can usually spare 2 to 3 days, and it may well show in the quality of your short stories and the quality of my short stories. But that's about what I feel these days I can actually manage.
Yeah. You've got to understand that I'm a very slow writer, a slow reader too, and this is one of the things I can enjoy a book like Daggers Drawn. My contemporaries are writing, whereas I probably will never get around to reading all their novels. In fact, very few of them will I get around to read. So I sort of tend to do a bit of reading before I fall asleep at night. And the ideal thing is there to have a good short story and come to the end of it and smile and turn up the light and have a good night's sleep. If I'm reading a novel at night, well, then the temptation is to go to the next chapter and the one after and so on. And I would have some very sleepless nights.
Of course, I have to say, with the Daggers Drawn anthology, the temptation is to go on to the next story because they are all really good.
Well, they're all winners. I mean, it made my job as an editor. It was one of the easiest anthologies I've ever edited, because obviously all the stories were already there. They'd all won Daggers, so in fact, there was no selection in the editorial process. So that was quite interesting. And I mean, it's such a pity that Stella can't be with us, as it would have been nice to have a female touch here tonight. And ironically, Stella's story, Martha Grace, was one I actually commissioned many years ago for one of my anthologies. And in fact, I remember Stella has actually won the short story Dagger twice also. I mean, as basically there's only 3 of us, I'm going to jump in a little bit to lighten your respective loads, so to speak. I mean, I'm in a slightly different situation. I mean, I love writing short stories, and I've written a lot of stories over the years, not just in the crime field. I've written probably more stories in the science fiction or fantasy and even erotica field, as halfway through my career, I was mostly writing literary erotica because it kept the bank manager happy. And I've written a lot of stories in that genre too. But I've always found writing novels, I mean, it hurts. I've written 20 novels, 10 under my own name and 10 under a pen name. And of course, naturally, my pen name outsells my own name by about 20 to 1, which is ironic. I mean, with my pen name, I've made the Sunday Times top 10 about, I think about 8 times. And but nobody knows it's me. But the money keeps on coming in, so I'm not complaining. But I do find
Is it Ian Rankin by any chance?
No.
Is your pen name Ian Rankin? No.
Ian would be very annoyed because he doesn't write erotica.
Maxim, would you pay us more to write erotica than to write crime stories? I mean, I think we should know this now.
Obviously, I mean, we're talking.
It's a little late for me, but I can try.
we're talking about Mysterious Galaxy, but so we're talking obviously crime thrillers, science fiction, and fantasy. But basically, there was a golden age of erotica. I mean, for years, editors and my agent keep on telling me when I delivered books, "Can you cut the sex scenes? Can we have slightly less sex scenes?" And I would say, "No, I write what I want to write," and as long as they published them, I was happy. And then, was it about 10 years ago, 6 months before 50 Shades of Grey appeared, there was already a buzz in the publishing world about this book. And every publisher in town thought, we need a counter 50 Shades of Grey. So suddenly my agents began getting phone calls from publishers saying, "Oh, we know we weren't very happy with Maxim and his sex scenes, but do you think he might be interested in taking all the crime and thriller out and just leaving the sex?" I was sent a very early copy of 50 Shades and I thought, God, this is awful. I barely could finish the opening chapter and then threw the book against the wall, the manuscript against the wall, and thought, God, this is an insult to quality erotica. So I did an outline. To cut a long story short, there was a bidding war, and I ended up spending the next 2.5 years of my life writing 10 novels of 120,000 words each. We sold, I think, about 7 million copies, and it sold to 31 countries. And then, and this is why I'm not trying to convince you to switch to erotica, and then it died on the vine. Almost overnight, sales collapsed purely because publishers, and I spent 20 years as a publisher myself, are like lemmings. They're always following the latest trends, and basically they just flooded the market with bad erotica. And right now, however good the book might be, no publisher in the UK or the US is going to look seriously at buying an erotic book, or at any rate paying decent money for it. So I mean, I've since gone back. I mean, since I wrote those 10 novels in 2.5 years, I took 3 years off because I was just burnt out, basically writing short stories and nonfiction. And since the first novel I wrote since then was, in fact, a detective story, which is being republished in America in March by Starkhouse Press, called the Louisiana Republic, which is a dystopia, but with a private eye after the world has collapsed into barbarism. And my latest novel, The Piper's Dance, which came out last July, is an outright fantasy, which is all about what happened to the children who followed the Pied Piper of Hamelin, and ends up with mermaids. No spoiler, I won't tell you what happens in the middle, but that's beside the point. But as I was saying before that long parenthesis, is I find novels incredibly powerful. I mean, it's really, when I start a novel, all I want to do is finish it. And I try to do my 5,000-6,000 words per day just to get it out of the way. And it's really painful because they keep me awake at night when I finish my section for the day. I keep on thinking of the final line and what the next line is going to be when I start the next morning. And I love writing short stories. I mean, there is a sense of almost instant reward because you can finish a short story in 5 or 6 days. I mean, unlike Peter, sometimes it might stretch to a couple of weeks if I have a problem with a story, because obviously short story with a novel, you can outline, the direction you're going in, whereas sometimes in a short story you've just got a feel for the ending. But I love writing short stories, and I think I'm rather good at them, better than at writing novels, in fact. But it's a different art altogether. I mean, not necessarily in the crime field, but are there any short story writers that either of you are particularly in admiration of or inspired by?
Or in my case, Roald Dahl, I think, wrote some superb short stories. So Lamb to the Slaughter is the one that I particularly enjoyed. Somebody once said that the joy of a short story is that it can be read in 10-15 minutes and remembered for a lifetime. And that's a plot that I think most people who've read it do remember for a long time afterwards. And there are one or two sort of stories that stand out that are like that make such an impression, more of an impression perhaps than any of the novels that the particular authors wrote. So
an example in point, of course, and he's only known really for short stories, is Edgar Allan Poe, of all people.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah. No, I definitely agree with Peter about Dahl. I mean, I discovered Dahl's short stories long before his children's stories, and they are very, very dark indeed. And in the children's stories, you can actually see some of the darkness seeping through from the short stories that he'd written before that. But in terms of who was the master of short stories, I think I would have said Hemingway, who wrote some absolutely magnificent short stories. The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber is probably my favourite for those who are who've read Hemingway. I think it's much more difficult now, though, to be a short story specialist in the way it was then. It's partly a matter of money. That you get for a short story now roughly what Hemingway was getting for a short story, sort of back in 1950 or whatever. The amount has not gone up at all. But also just short stories seem to have fallen out of fashion a bit. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Since we're trying to sell short stories to people.
The magazine market is much smaller, isn't it? I say the magazine market is much smaller than it used to be.
Yeah.
One could occasionally place a story with a magazine and make a lot of money. You're never going to make a lot of money from writing for the CWA, with respect to our chairman sitting on this side.
No, I mean, basically, I did my PhD in comparative literature decades ago on F. Scott Fitzgerald, of course, who wrote a lot of short stories and is still a major influence on me. And at the height of his career, and this was in the late 1930s, early 40s, he was being paid $5,000 a story by Esquire of a Saturday Evening Post. And the same with Hemingway. In those days, people could make a living out of writing short stories. For me, my main influences in short stories outside of the genre are basically, Catherine Mansfield, Chekhov, and Isaac Bashevis Singer, who are all, I think they're short stories. Outweigh their novels in some cases. There are very few novels anyway. Oh, and Isaac Babel also, of course, the Cossack stories of Isaac Babel.
Yes.
And in fact, you were mentioning Hemingway. I mean, my own personal Hemingway favorite is The Snows of Kilimanjaro, which
Yeah,
is also
absolutely.
a lovely melancholy story. And to keep on plugging the CWA, as I'm obligated to do, there is the CWA, in addition to the Daggers, also publishes the occasional anthology, which is edited by another ex-chair, the wonderful Martin Edwards. And there is a new, coming out in March, there is a new CWA anthology, the first one in a few years, called The Music of Night, which are all crime stories on the subject of music. I don't know whether either of you have stories in it. I haven't seen the book yet.
Yes. Yep.
You have a
I've
story.
got one in that.
And I have a story in it. My story was
Yeah.
actually slightly inspired by Hemingway's The Killers.
Oh.
And there was an acknowledgement at the end of the story too, so that people don't say, "Oh, you stole that plot part from Ernest Hemingway." And what is your story? What is your forthcoming story about, Len?
Mine is called his greatest hit, and I have tried to write a short story in a pop song format, verse by verse, with intros and outros and bridges and so on. So, but that again is one of the things. I mean, I wouldn't risk doing that with a novel. But it's something you can try with a short story, and if nobody likes it, well, it doesn't really matter. You haven't sort of invested a vast amount into it. So yeah, a fairly experimental one.
It's interesting. I mean, I mean, are you a lover of, shall we say, more traditional?
Yes, mine
music?
in that collection. Yeah. Oh, we're losing. Oh.
You mentioned
mine in
the
that
pop
collection called "And the Band Played On."
Oh, you have a story in it too. So we all have stories in it. Anyway, so for Mysterious Galaxy
But we're talking
customers,
about Daggers Drawn, aren't we?
it's coming out from Flame Tree Publishing in March. Martin Edwards is the editor, and it's the music of the night.
Yes.
We promote anything to do with the CWA.
What we do.
Oh yes, I can see they put the references there. And I mean, is your story more about music in general, or is it about any type of particular music, Peter?
It's about oh dear, no, it's about a family. It's a kind of it's a story within a family, and how a particular tune becomes important for them and drives them all mad in one way. But yeah, I enjoyed writing that very much. So it's good sometimes to have a theme suggested to you. Obviously, it inspired Len, and I look forward very much to that. It's the sort of thing that Simon Brett sometimes attempts and does very successfully. Things in verse and just experimental writing, which is perfectly okay, I think, for a short story collection.
I mean, listening to what you mentioned of your story, Len, I mean, it would be interesting if there's going to be an audio version of the book.
Oh yes. I think there should be a CD to accompany the to accompany the book. Yeah.
They should.
Sorry.
No.
Okay. The short story for that particular collection, though, is the only one that overlaps with the novels. So I've actually got two of my series characters from the Herring series, Ethelred and Elsie, actually appear in it, which I have not done before because, as I say, I've used the short stories on the whole to get away and do something completely different. So lots of different themes, lots of different overlaps in that.
That's interesting because,
just
as
occasionally,
I
I've used my novel characters in the short story, but not in this collection, but in other collections.
No, it's interesting what you were saying, Len, because I mean, as I confessed earlier, I find novels really painful to write, and between novels, I write a lot of short stories, and sometimes the next novel usually comes out of one of the short stories I write between novels. Suddenly, the short story, I mean, my last one, in fact, I wrote a short story, and then for a few months I was looking at that story and I liked it. And I thought, but how did the characters come to that point? So I actually went back in time, so to speak, and wrote about where everything that happened before that particular story, once revised, became the final chapter of the novel. And it gives me a sort of a jumping board into a novel when I'm finding it difficult to come up with an idea for a new novel. Are there any particular crime writers? I mean, Peter mentioned Simon Brett, who will be in the follow-up volume of Daggers Drawn, because unfortunately he hasn't won it, but he has been shortlisted several times, and there will be a story of Simon's in the next volume. Are there any particular writers in the crime and thriller genre that you particularly enjoy reading at short length?
I mean, Conan Doyle is the obvious one to quote, because most of the Sherlock Holmes stories are actually short stories. Some of the big ones were novels, Study in Scarlet and Hound of the Baskervilles and so on, but almost all of the Sherlock Holmes stories that you think of actually started as short stories. Yeah, you've got to admire that. I mean, Christie's Poirot short stories.
It's worth remembering, really, that the history of the crime novel and of crime writing sort of goes back to the short story. I mean, you mentioned Edgar Allan Poe earlier, Maxim, and he was the father of it all. But you know, it leads on towards Conan Doyle and Chesterton writing the Father Brown stories. Is another good example. So the short story was terribly strong and terribly influential, I think, in the development of the crime generally. And it wasn't really until the so-called golden age, the sort of 20s and 30s, that same way as those short stories.
No, indeed. And of course, we're talking about the golden age. And of course, I mean, many of the writers of the golden age published in the pulp magazines, and they started off basically as short stories. I mean, Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, Stanley Gardner, all came out of the magazines where they published short stories, many of which, some of which, shall we say, they later cannibalized or started putting them together as novels, but some of them began as short stories. And obviously, I mean, some of the old great classics, I mean, obviously the Dashiell Hammett's Continental Op stories still survive wonderfully today. Anyway, I would like to ask, are there any questions from to Peter, to Len, or myself, or on the subject of CWA, the Daggers, or anything crime related?
So I figured I'd pop in and help with the questions that are down below. So welcome back, everyone. This first one we're going to pull is from Brenda. Brenda asks, this seems like to you, Maxim, with judging. What are the criteria you use to judge whether a story is worthy of an award or worthy of recommending?
Well, basically, it's not up to me. The Daggers have got very clear rules. Authors have to submit. The story has to have been published in the previous calendar year. They have to be submitted by the author, and then there is a panel of judges which is totally independent. Nobody else at the CWA has any influence, not just for the short story Dagger, but also for all categories. There are 4 or 5 judges. They read everything and then they advise of their deliberations. And the CWA board accepts their decisions. with no reservation whatsoever. And I think over the years, the Daggers have a pretty good track record. If I might be slightly controversial, when I look at basically the Edgars or the Anthonys of the last 30 or 40 years, there are some odd selections, or in many cases, authors who you sort of wonder, why have they never been awarded? When you look back at the Daggers over the years, every major writer in the field has won a Dagger at some stage.
Yes, I think that's true, but I can't say that I've been steadily through the lists of the Anthony winners and the Edgar winners, making this kind of comparison. Perhaps they're far better known to American readers, the names that you were thinking of, than perhaps to the Brits. I just to come in with this, but I do love Don series, which I know you've interviewed him, Maxim, and talked a little about him. I've seen things on YouTube that you do, but on Don Westlake. But he was a great friend.
Yeah.
Are you hearing me?
You're breaking up slightly, but you're okay now. You're okay now.
Oh yes. I was just talking about Don Westlake and the Dortmund series of comic short stories, which I treasure and reread. I like them so much, even though I know the outcome of the stories. But I'm quite happy just for the sheer joy of the writing to read them again.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
We've lost Peter.
Yeah. We had an internet problem, but I'm sure he'll reconnect within a few minutes.
While he does.
Any views then?
On judging short stories, was that the original? Is that the question we're still on? Yeah, I mean, I think the judging process is actually quite interesting, because the judges are really looking for something which is a good short story in its own right, but also a crime story. And even reading through this collection, a lot of the stories I liked best actually were only marginally crime stories. Certainly in the conventional sort of Marjorie Allingham, sort of a crime, a mystery, an investigation, a conclusion. An awful lot of them didn't fall into that category, and I wonder whether it just shows that each judging panel takes a slightly different view as to what is a crime story, let alone what is a good crime story.
Yeah, I've never been a judge on that particular Dagger. I've been a judge on other categories. I've been a judge on the First Novel Award, and I'm currently a judge on the translated in the translation category. Well, Peter just about to come back. Welcome back, Peter.
Welcome back.
Yes.
And
thank you very much. I don't know how it happened.
Yeah, the internet. And I think the reason for what you pointed out, Len, is that probably, I mean, this is guesswork. My feeling is that possibly the judges are looking for something different. I mean, they've read all the traditional puzzles, the puzzle stories, the stories which begin with a body and end up with the sleuth in whichever format he or she is, identifying the killer. And they've seen it in so many novels, and it's also more difficult to have that traditional plot in a short story. So I get a feeling that because the judges change every few years, it's never the same panel every year. No judge can sit on a particular in a particular category for more than 3 years. So every year we have new judges coming in. But I think the reason they have come up with that type of winner is possibly because they're looking for innovation. They're looking for something different.
No, I think you can see that in this collection, because it's an enormously varied collection that we've got. Some very, very dark stuff in there. Some, including mine, I think relatively light and so on. But that's what I really enjoyed about the collection. That each story was very different from each of the others, and I think that's because crime fiction encompasses such an enormous range. You know, through from the thriller to the police procedural to the amateur detective and so on, and that is actually reflected in this book, which is good.
I mean, people of knowing my connection with the crime field and what I write are always coming up. I mean, what is it you like about crime stories? And my answer is basically because there are no limits to the field. There are no rules. It's not just body, find the killer. There is so much more to crime and thriller writing. And any other questions?
Yes. So this one is by Michelle. So this is going to be for any one of you. Has there ever been a character that you originally conceptualized as the hero, but instead wrote them as the villain? Thank you, Michelle.
That's a good one.
Yes, any one of you want to answer that?
I don't think I can.
I'm desperately trying to think whether I have or not. I mean, it's a brilliant idea, obviously, that somebody starts as the hero and becomes the villain, or starts as the villain and becomes the hero. And that sort of deception is usually at the very center of an awful lot of crime plots. But I'm just trying to think when I have actually done it. Possibly not. But having said that, let me, Peter.
Yes, I confess that I've never got around to that. I certainly, I've written a few stories about villains and about sort of so people who might be and may not be, but I don't think I can ever remember starting out with one thing and then suddenly realizing that they ought to be the other. How about you, Matt?
I've done something similar, I suppose, which is to base a character on somebody I rather disliked in real life. And as I wrote the book, I changed my mind about this person and decided that I rather liked them after all. So their character changed in parallel with that, and they actually ended up quite nice in the end.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in my case, it's slightly different insofar as I don't write. When I have written crime, it has been very untraditional crime. And I don't think I've ever had a hero. And in fact, neither in any of my crime books have I ever had a policeman. So I usually tend to have anti-heroes, which means that they automatically are possibly on the bad side by the time you get to the end of the book.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Michelle, for that one. Now, this one, all three of you gentlemen have probably answered this at some point in your careers, but we're going to ask you here. At one point in your life, did you realize that writing was your calling?
Well, I'll start. Basically, it started when I was 12 years old and I was at school. Because my parents moved to Paris in France when I was 3 years old, I was brought up in France. And initially, of course, I couldn't speak French. I was a little English boy and I was being bullied at school. I was a little English boy. Oh, you're the one who burned Joan of Arc, which technically was incorrect because she was actually burnt by the French, as I kept on pointing out, having done my later research. Anyway, I had a wonderful teacher in that I can't remember which form it was, but I know I was 12 years old, and instead of giving us sort of traditional essays, that particular year the teacher said, write an essay, and it doesn't, you don't have to do research or do anything, just try and write something different, something imaginative. And I thought, I can invent something. And I wrote, I mean, probably it's totally unreadable now, but out of all the kids in the form, it was the one he preferred, and I had to come up on stage to read it, and then the 6 handwritten pages were put on the wall of the classroom, and I got the bug. I wanted to be a writer. And basically, by the end of that particular year, we had to do one of those imaginative essays every month. By the end of the school year, I'd won all of them bar one, bar the final one. But the teacher had told me in confidence, yours was a better one, but we had to give it to somebody else for once. And his name was Monsieur Laurent, and I owe him my career as a writer. Of course, I was an only child for many, many years. I was already 13 when my sister was born, and I was a voracious reader. And of course, you can't become a writer if you're not a reader. And I was lucky enough that at the time, as I mentioned, I was into science fiction. I even did a science fiction fanzine when I was 14 or 15, and I started writing for science fiction magazines. First of all, writing to the Reader's Column, where I was first published, in a letter to the editor, where of course with a name like mine they misspelled it, but I was so proud of my first publication. And being English and being brought up in France, I grew up bilingual, and I obviously would read in English, and I started talking to the people at the magazine saying, oh, you should publish Philip K. Dick, you should publish so-and-so. And eventually they asked me to do some translations, and it just, I got to know the French science fiction milieu, and wrote a novel and sold it. And I had my first novel published in France when I was 16. Sorry about that.
I mentioned earlier that I was interested in long distance running, and that my very first book was a non-fiction book about the history of long distance running. It was because I would have loved to have been an athlete myself, but I was hopeless at all kinds of sports, couldn't catch a ball, came last in the school cross-country race, and was generally completely inept at all forms of sport. But in order to feel that I could participate, I decided to learn a lot more about it. And eventually I felt confident enough to write a book about running. And that was the beginning. That was really what gave me the writing bug. I enjoyed so much doing that, but I thought, well, I can't write another book on running. What else can I do? I can't write one on hammer throwing or discus throwing. I don't think any publisher will want to publish that. Then along came a competition for a first crime novel, and I was talking it over with my wife, and the prize was more than my salary as a teacher in those days. And she said, well, why don't you use the history of running in some way as the background? And I remember that I read about, when I was researching the first book, I'd read about these strange long distance contests that went on in the Agricultural Hall, Islington, in the 1880s, when people would go round and round a small indoor track and cover up to 600 miles in the course of a week. And there was betting, and there were sort of bent trainers, and there were gentlemen who wanted to sort of prove their manliness, and people coming off the street just to earn a few crusts. And it was perfect, really, as the background of a novel. So that became a book called Wobble to Death, and I won the competition, and I was launched.
Excellent. How about you, Len?
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning of my first book, Herring Seller's Apprentice, my narrator begins by saying, I have always been a writer. And I think that's pretty much how I feel about it. At school, my favorite subjects were sort of history and English. So I was more or less perfectly equipped to write historical novels, which is what I ended up doing. But there's a gap of sort of about 35 years between that and actually writing the first book. And I tried to write all sorts of things in between, but it was only really when I thought, yeah, I'll write a crime novel, that I solved my real problem, which was that I wasn't terribly good at plots. But crime writing actually gives you a framework within which to write. And I think I actually needed that. I was sort of freewheeling a bit with the other stuff. But once you've actually sort of got a body there and you've got to explain how the body got there, I think that that's actually, it's a tremendous discipline, I think, to write within a framework, and particularly if you're writing fairly traditional crime novels, as I do, then you have Knox's Decalogue and other things, that you're working within, and so that was that. In the end, I produced a crime novel, and I became a crime novelist. Though I didn't know I was a crime novelist until my editor told me. I thought I'd written a book with a body in it.
I mean, also, I'd add, when I mentioned, obviously, I'd published my first book at 16. I'd actually written in French because I was living in France. But so that people are not as impressed as they should be, let me say that it took me another 22 years to publish another book.
Oh. Well, unfortunately, we are pretty much out of time, but also fortunately, many of the questions I'm looking over here, many of you have already answered in one way or another through the discussion, so we're good there. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. If you haven't already, as a reminder, Daggers Drawn, you can purchase that with us. The link down below will take you to our website. As Maxim mentioned, Music of the Night, that is going to be the next CWA anthology book to release. That is coming out next month, if my notes are right, February 22nd. So you can go ahead and pre-order that now. Len, Maxim, Peter, thank you so much for doing this with us. I know with some internet issues across the pond, but you made it work.
Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah,
And
thank
everyone-
you. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Bye.
And if you want to, you can also rewatch this later on our YouTube channel. We're going to archive this video in a couple days or so. Until next time, guys. See you around. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.